Hey everyone, Oscar, founder of Blonde here. Today we're going to be showing you how to make a band style ring. Okay, so we know how to make basic stacker rings with thin wire. We're now going to be building on the skills that we've learned to make thicker band style rings. You'll have a lot more creative freedom with these band style rings to add personalizations like letters or numbers on the inside or outside, as well as an array of textures and finishes we'll show you how to do at the end. Before we get started, you'll want to pick out the piece of metal that we're going to be using today. For this demo, I'm going to be using a 5mm flat wire, but your box would have come with a few different options you can choose from. Generally speaking, the thinner the wire, the easier your rings will be to make. So I recommend starting off with the thinner wire and progressing on to the thicker wire as you go. You'll notice there are two key styles in the pouch that we've sent you, and they are the flat wire rings and the domed wire rings. You'll notice a difference in the profile. One will be flat and one will be domed. I also recommend starting with the flatter wire because this will be easier to learn on. For this demo, I'm going to be using a piece of 5mm flat wire so that you can follow along nice and easily. We'll begin by sizing out our ring size the exact same way as we did with ring 1. So if you haven't, again, watched that video, click up here and we'll take you back to how to size your ring. Once again, start by setting your dividers to the correct length for your ring size. Once you've got these set, you can then mark 2 scratches on your metal the same way as we did before. It can be helpful with this second ring to also transfer your marks with a scribe onto the top edge of your metal. And once again, to improve visibility, just draw over them with a marker or Sharpie. After you've marked it, your ring shank should look something like this. This time around, if you know you're going to be wanting some hammered textures at the end, that's going to stretch your ring out. So we need to compensate for that now by starting off a size or 2 down from where we want to end up. If you want a really deep texture, I would go 2 sizes down, and if you want something more light, go for 1 size down. Finishes done with files or polishing won't change your size, so you don't need to account for these kind of finishes right now. Once we've marked out our ring shank, we now know how much of this material we're going to be using for our ring size, and the only part of the ring we want to personalize before we solder it round is our stamping. If you want to put letters or numbers on the inside or outside of the ring, it's a lot easier to do that with stamps while the ring shank is still flat like this, i.e. before we go on to bending it around. That's why we'll start with our lettering or stamping if we're going for it right now, rather than waiting until after the ring's round, which will be a lot more difficult. To add letters or numbers on the inside or the outside of your ring, you'll need to be using the stamps that we've sent you, as well as your steel ball peen hammer and the steel stamping block. Your letters and numbers may come a little bit oily. That's to prevent them from rusting, so you may want to clean them up with a paper towel before you get going for the first time. Simply select the letter or number that you want on the inside or outside of your ring, give it a good look, and then place it firmly down on the shank. It can be difficult to get these absolutely perfect, but with practice you should get a better aim. Once you're pressing it firmly down with your non-dominant hand onto the metal, you can then grab your ball peen hammer and simply tap once over the top of it. Again, make sure that you're hammering on the steel block when you do this. We're going to go for 1 firm strike because if we repeatedly tap and our stamp moves, you'll notice that you get a double impression or a slight sort of shadow effect, and the impression won't be crisp. So just 1 firm tap is all you need with your steel hammer here. Just keep in mind that the more letters and numbers that you stamp into the piece, the more work hardened and brittle your metal is going to become. So if you want to make it a little bit easier for you, I recommend going for less rather than more when you're first starting out. You can absolutely fill it up with letters and numbers, but the next steps like bending and sawing are going to be more difficult for you, so keep that in mind. Lettering and numbering can be a really nice way of adding personalization to your ring. You might want to do initials, a name, a date, or something that makes the ring more special to you. If you're doing stamping, once that's finished, we can then move on to trimming our shank and then on to forming. We trim our shank because it's going to be easier to work with something that's closer to the actual size of material that we need. So I'm going to now demonstrate how to cut off the 2 excess sides that we don't need anymore. You can also do this step with a pair of wire cutters or snips, but we've got a jeweler's saw and we might as well practice with it. Safety glasses are on for sawing, and now I'm going to demonstrate where you need to saw. This time around, we're not going to be cutting through or along the lines of our marks, okay? We're going to be cutting instead about 3 millimeters from the edge to leave us with a small amount of metal excess on each side. So don't cut through your lines at this step, cut outside of them. Once again, make sure that you're holding your silver nice and firmly down into the bench peg as you go, and use the same techniques we taught you in ring 1 to saw through the edge. We've cut off the excess to assist us with this step here, which is going to be forming. Our objective when we're forming the metal is to get our two lines to overlap one another. If you remember with ring 1, what we did, and what you still can do with these larger shanks, is cut off each side individually, then file them really, really flat, bend them around, and solder afterwards. However, as a beginner, what I'd recommend doing is a slightly different technique I'm going to show you now. What we're doing with these thicker wire shanks is we're going to be overlapping the metal and then cutting through both sides simultaneously. I think this is the easiest method to get a really nice join when you're a beginner, because what will inevitably happen if you try and cut the sides individually is you'll go slightly to the left on one side or slightly to the right on the other and spend ages filing until they're absolutely perfect, which is going to lose you a lot of material and time in the process. Instead, what we can do is bend our two lines so that they're sitting directly on top of each other and then cut through at the same time. That way, even if you go slightly left or slightly right, the mark of the cut is going to be mirrored on both ends of your shank and it's going to meet up really nice and flush. To explain that with my knuckles, imagine that your two marks on the metal are my two knuckles. What we're now going to do with our metal is slowly bend, bend, bend until our marks or my knuckles are sitting right on top of each other. We can then cut through both sides simultaneously to leave us with a really flush and even cut. The forming stage and getting your lines to overlap is going to be a lot easier if you've taken off the excess like I've already done now. To form your metal, we're going to be using a very similar technique as we taught you with our first ring, using our round nose pliers to start to bend our shank into shape. Using a really light touch so we don't leave deep marks on our metal, we're going to start from one side and bend our ring into a nice little fish hook or umbrella handle. We're then going to do the exact same thing from the opposite end, bending this side around until it meets closely with the opposite side. Once we've got our two little fish hooks pointing towards each other, we now need to close this gap between them and get our two lines to sit right over the top of each other. I like to do this by grabbing one side of the wire and using my palm to push the other side over. Again, we're going to use that technique we learned before about tension. We want to push the wire slightly past where we eventually want them to sit on each side, like so. So this ring here is pretty close, but what I'm noticing is there's a little bit of a gap between the two pieces on the top and the bottom. To get these two to sit much closer together, we can fold them over the opposite side of each other to create tension up and down. That's going to rest them nice and tightly against each other. At this stage, you want to look out for a few things with your ring that will make your join and cutting a good one a lot easier. You want your two pieces really tightly up against each other. You also want them really nice and level so that they're on the same plane. You don't want your ring jutting out in any way. You don't want something like that, where you can see the edge of the wire is poking out this way. You want it directly behind each other so that the cut is mirrored evenly on both sides. It should look something like this before you start cutting through it. The closer you get your two pieces of wire together, the better your joins will end up and the easier time you'll have cutting through the metal. So take your time and get it right before you start cutting. When cutting through the thicker metal, it's important to have the thicker saw blade that we've sent in your kit in your actual saw frame. This is going to be really critical when we start to cut through both sides simultaneously. Okay, so we're now ready to cut through our ring using our jeweler's saw and the techniques we've showed you previously. The extra thing you'll need to pick up is how to hold on to a ring while you saw through it, because it's a little bit different to holding on to a piece of metal. The grip that I'm going to show you now is the one that I found most beginners have the best success with, but I'll also show you a couple of alternatives that you could use if you don't find this one comfortable. My favorite grip, and the one I'm showing you now, is called the claw grip, which is a grip where we hold onto our ring by pinching it through our saw blade. There's a big space between the blunt side of your saw blade and your saw frame, which you're going to put 2 fingers through, your index and middle finger. And then with your thumb, we're going to be pinching our ring on either side to hold it steady. And once we're in position, cutting through that space in between. I'm going to demonstrate how to hold onto it now. So I'm going 2 fingers through and then grabbing onto my wire and sawing through the middle. Once you're in position, just make sure at no point you leave any fingers behind the saw blade when cutting. You want to make sure they're all out of the way. You also want to make sure that your join, or the section of the ring you're cutting through, is once again at the tip of that V that's carved into your bench peg. A popular alternative would be the underside grip, where you hold your ring from underneath the bench peg. I personally don't like this one, but some people do find it easier, and it will be easier, especially if you've got longer nails. Your ring should be in the same place at the top of that V cut in your bench peg, but this time around we're going to come underneath our peg and grab onto it from each side, like so. Again, with this grip, you want to be holding your ring firmly downwards into the bench peg to stop it from slipping around, and also be making sure that there's nothing underneath your saw so that when it cuts through, your hand isn't underneath it. Just be careful when you start to get close to cutting through your ring, and make sure that no part of your hand is beneath the saw frame. Start with the same push strokes we've shown you before coming back and forth. You may find it easier to switch sides of your bench peg so that you've got a level surface while you make this cut. After you cut through your ring shank, you want to check for any edges or things you might want to clean up. Test your ring by pushing the sides together and seeing if they join super flush. If they do, then we can move on to getting them to rest up against each other. But if they don't, here's a quick tip on how to improve the join of your ring. You can see with this example, the 2 sides of my wire, even when I push them close together, are still leaving me with a gap at the bottom side, a big crack. This is the kind of example when you'd want to use this technique. By sawing down that crack, you're going to level out the wire on both sides and leave yourself with a flush joint once again. At this stage, we're just trying to get our 2 pieces of wire to sit super flush and flat up against each other. We're not worried about the angle of the cut, but we're worried if there's space between our 2 pieces of metal, so that's why the crack is a problem. Start by overlapping the wire by pushing the metal past where you want them to eventually sit before pulling it back slowly into position. When you're fixing up a join, before sawing through both sides simultaneously, you need to line up the ring shank with where it needs to sit once it's finished. So check carefully that both of the wires are sitting level and aligned, and that they're both pushing up against each other with some tension before you run your saw frame through the middle of it. It's the exact same process, but what it's going to do is it's going to cut through the join and try to follow the original cut that you've made, removing any of that excess in the middle that's preventing it from being nice and flush. Doing that process once or twice should leave you with 2 really flush edges that meet up against each other really nicely. Remember, when you're cutting through the ring this time around, you're trying to follow the original cut you've made through the 2 pieces of wire as closely as you can, so the end result is something nice and flush like this. Once your cut is nice and flush, we're then going to line our 2 pieces of metal up right against each other so that we can solder our ring together. This is the most critical step for the quality of your ring join later on. The more time you spend making sure your wire is as level and as flush as possible, the better and more seamless your ring join will look. So if you're finding that you're making rings that have big cracks or visible joins in them after you solder, you may want to revisit the forming stage here to make sure that your ring is ready to go. Spend lots and lots of time lining the 2 ends of your wire up together, nice and flush. Remember, we're not trying to make our ring round just yet. We're just trying to get our 2 sides to sit as flush against each other as we can. Ideally, they're also going to be nice and level, so they're not at an angle with each other. Run your finger across the seam on all 4 sides of your ring to feel out for any big cracks or gaps. If it feels nice and smooth, you should be ready to move on. Again, I really want to stress this part of the ring making process. The more time you spend obsessing over the ring join prior to soldering, the easier every next step is going to be. Once the join of your ring is flush on every angle as you look at it and spin it in your hands, and nice and smooth as you run your fingers across the edges, we're then ready to solder the join together. Your ring join should look something like this prior to soldering. Think of this step as matching your 2 pieces up together in a puzzle. The cut doesn't need to be straight, it can be at an angle, but they need to fit together nice and seamlessly. The steps for soldering are the exact same as when we soldered our first smaller bands, so you can refer back to that video, but we'll go through the same steps here as well. Start once again with the ring you're soldering right in the middle of your soldering board and give it a bit of breathing room around your workspace. Then add a chip of the solder underneath the join of your ring so that the ring join rests over the top of it. You can once again use your solder pick to fine-tune the adjustment or placement of your solder if you need to. Then put a couple of droplets of flux over your join to allow your solder to flow. Once you're ready to heat your torch up, put safety glasses on and repeat the same process as we went through before. This time around, we'll want our gas torch on full gas because we need to heat up much more metal than we did before. So open the gas valve on your torch all the way and press the trigger on the back to ignite the flame. Once again, when we're soldering, it's really key to reach an even temperature with our entire piece. Okay? The solder is going to flow to the hottest part. So with these bigger rings, I recommend starting at the back side of the band, tracing the edges of the metal with your flame until they start to change color. You can then bring the torch around the entire ring, going in small, slow circles to let the metal heat up. Once we get close to the melting temperature of our solder, we'll want to focus on the front side of our ring to help the solder flow evenly into our join. When the solder reaches its melting temperature, it should shoot up your join, sealing your ring, and your ring in turn should fall level with your board. You'll see it in real time as you do it yourselves at home. Once you see this, apply a little bit more heat evenly to each side of the join to make sure the flux covers both sides nice and evenly. Then cool your ring down once again with your pliers into your cup of water. After your ring's cooled down, we want to do what's called the pull test. This is essentially testing the strength of our join by grabbing either side of the cold ring and trying to rip it open with our hands. If we pass the pull test, we can then move on to the next step. If your ring join breaks open during hammering or fails the pull test, we're going to show you now how to clean up the join prior to resoldering it. There's a couple ways we can clean up the join prior to resoldering. We can either use files or that same cutting method that I showed you earlier. If you're using files, make sure that all of the solder that's formed inside of the join or inside of your cut is completely removed before you try to resolder. And if you're using the overlap method and cutting through the join once again, follow the steps we've showed you before. We can then round our rings out on our ring mandrel. You'll notice that they have the Australian and UK ring sizes written down it from top to bottom. To start, simply put your ring over the top of the mandrel and pull it down as far as you can with your fingers. Once it's not moving any further, we can then get our nylon hammer involved and start to hammer the ring nice and round. I recommend wearing safety glasses for this step. Simply roll the ring and the mandrel in your hands, same way we did for our thinner stacker rings. Once the ring is nice and round, it should drop down to the size that you're going for. You can check to make sure by looking downwards that there's no gaps between the ring and the mandrel, and that you've hammered all of the different sides nice and round. Once you're here, take the ring off the mandrel, flip it over, and go again from the other side to make sure that each side is nice and round. You can brace the mandrel into your stomach or sternum to give yourselves a bit more support. If your ring gets stuck onto the mandrel and you can't remove it with your fingers, simply place it firmly down on the table and hammer the ring off. This whole process will put a significant amount of stress on your joints, so if they break open, you'll need to repeat the soldering step once again before coming back to rounding them out. Once your ring is nice and round on both sides, try it on your finger to see if it fits. If you notice that already it's too big or too small, click on this link here and we'll show you how to do ring resizing. It's important to go through resizing your ring prior to finishing and polishing because we may need to resolder the joint, which is going to cause you to repeat all of the cleanup once again. Although it's less likely to happen with thicker band rings, you may also want to de-warp or flatten these ones too, making sure they're nice and level across the sides. You can do so by using your stamping block and placing the ring flat down on the top. If you notice any sections are standing up, then you'll want to once again use your hammer, holding half of the ring down, and hammer over the top of any sides that are sticking up or not level with the material. Spin the ring in your hands as you go to make sure you're getting all the different sides of your ring nice and level. Remember to flip the ring over to the other side and repeat the same process here to make sure you end up with something nice and level if that's what you want. Great, so we're now ready to finish our ring. Remember, finishing is a two-step process involving filing and then polishing. With our filing, we're focusing on the joint of the ring. We're going to remove any excess solder and start to blend the two sides together so that it's nice and seamless. Any small gaps or cracks in the ring can be filed out at this stage, making sure the ring join is super clean. Once we finish the ring join, we'll then move on to polishing the rest of the surface and removing any of the oxide that's formed on the silver while we've soldered it. To file our join, we're once again going to be using the same steps as with ring 1. This time around, if you've got a bigger join, you may want to start with a rougher, coarser file before moving on to the needle files. Hang your ring off the side of your bench peg, like this, with the join facing up so it's nice and visible. And then remember, we want to do firm push strokes away from ourselves with our file, just over the join to remove any seam. Remember to roll your wrist and follow the round contour of the ring as you file to avoid creating any flat spots. If you're starting with the coarser file, you'll then want to progress onto the smoother needle files before moving on to polishing. Repeat the same process once again using the smaller files. With practice, you should be able to completely remove the seam between the two pieces of metal with filing before you move on to polishing. But if not, just make sure everything's nice and smooth to the touch by running a finger across the join. Once you've done the outside, repeat the same process on the top and bottom side and then on the inside. Remember, for the outside, top and bottom of our ring, we'll be using our flat surface files. And for the inside, we'll be swapping to a rounded file to make sure the round inside contour of the ring is preserved. When filing the inside, make sure you use the rounded side of your needle files. Place your ring upright with the bench peg underneath it and repeat the same rough push strokes away from yourself to blend the inside join together. Remember that when you're filing, we're trying to remove metal and remove any of the excess solder that's built up in or around the join, so you need to be relatively rough with your files. Once we've finished our filing, the ring join should be nice and smooth to the touch, and then we can move on to either polishing and personalizing our rings. To polish your rings, you'd simply be following the same process as we went through with our original wire stacker rings, working your way up a series of gridded sandpaper and finishing with the polishing paper to make your surface really nice and bright. but there may be a few other options that you want to consider instead of going for something super, super bright. If you'd like to add texture to your ring by hammering it, then you may need to consider which style of finish you're going for. If you want something darker and grungier, you'll want to hammer before you polish. And if you want something textured but still really nice and bright, polish all the way up to your desired finish and then texture at the very end. To polish our rings today, we'll start with sandpaper and finish with some jeweler's polishing paper at the very end. Remember when you're using your sandpaper to polish to start at the lowest, coarsest grit and work your way up through the different grits to leave yourself with a nice, even polish. The polishing on the outside, top and bottom of the ring will be easiest with the emery sticks that we've pre-prepared and shown you how to make before. Using the same motion and position as you would with your file, simply brush the exterior surface of your ring all the way around until you've completely removed all of the dark oxide. You can also just simply use your hands and the sandpaper to scrub the outside surfaces that you need to. After working through your sandpaper, you can then move on to your jeweler's polishing paper that we've included in your kits. Remember, there's 3 different grits, and we've ordered them 1 through 3 in the order that you should be using them. Use the side of the paper that we haven't numbered to slowly scrub the surface and improve the shine of your ring if you want something really, really shiny. You don't have to polish all the way up to the final paper if you want a more matte or satin finish on your ring. Simply stop earlier along the grits or somewhere along your grit journey, or during the time you're using the sandpaper instead. You just need to get in there with a bit of elbow grease and start to scrub the surface of your ring nice and evenly with each paper. You can use a finger or a mandrel to get the inside of your ring more easily. If you're going for something mirror finish, remember to finish with your jeweler's rouge cloth, starting with the red side and finishing with the yellow side of the cloth. If you're not seeing a super bright shine at this stage, you'll need to go back to an earlier or more coarse grit and repolish a little bit more evenly before bringing it up. Just with the sandpaper and the polishing papers we provided, you should be able to get something super, super bright and shiny if that's what you're after. Awesome, so that's start to finish on how to make yourself a band style ring at home. If you're keen on adding more personalization with textures and different finishes, watch the next video.